And so when I started to look at my dissertation work, I was working on a site in Lake County called Hawk's Nest, and I really had nothing to compare it to. So I started to look at a wider region. And with these dispersed and very mobile populations, you really have to move your scale of view from a single artifact to a site to a regional level to gain a better understanding of just what the systems that these folks and the adaptations that they had, how they were operating. And I originally started out looking at purely trying to decipher their economic systems. How were they making a living? We, for about the past almost 100 years now, have thought we've known, or we've had a very good story about Paleo-Indians and the Clovis people, which has started to unravel. And that, for me, is very interesting. When we start to question what we think we know, to me, that's a good sign. It's a sign of a state of health in science when we're questioning our assumptions and willing to change those viewpoints as new data is gathered. So the scientific process is playing out. Most of you have probably heard the term Clovis, but I'll give just a little brief kind of a review here. We're talking about the colonization of North America, and this is beginning at the end of the last ice age. So about 20,000 years ago, we had what we call the LGM, or the last glacial maximum, and we had ice sheets that covered much of the mid-continent and the northern third of North America. And if you can kind of see in that green line, let me maybe drop another light out here. The blue line is the Illinois glacial maximum, which is about 100,000 years ago. And the green line is the extent of the ice sheets at about 20,000 years ago. Now, so I'll be throwing some terms around. So the last glacial maximum, 20,000, I'll often refer to the late Pleistocene. That's the very end of the last glacial period at about 12,000 years ago. And the early Holocene, which begins about 10,000 years ago. These are somewhat arbitrarily set. But when we talk about kind of adaptations and environmental changes, so we can see the extent of the ice sheets. There was so much ice locked up that worldwide ocean levels were as much as 300 feet lower. So it was an immense amount of water locked up in these ice sheets. They were quite extensive, and much of Illinois was overridden. Beginning about 20,000 years ago, that ice age started to come to an end, and those sheets started a series of recessions and readvances, eventually withdrawing southward to their present-day positions. But what's interesting to note is that Earth is more often than not in an ice age. We should really think of ourselves as an ice age planet. We just happen to be in the Holocene period in what we call an interstadial period. But for most of human evolutionary history, we have evolved under the pressure of ice ages. And the waxing and the waning of ice ages has really affected the colonization of the planet. And when we talk about the colonization of the New World, this is the last and the greatest colonization event in human history. It is the final and the greatest dispersal of modern humans across the planet. And it is one of the enduring kind of archaeological mysteries in North American archaeology. When and where did people get here? For many years, we thought we had a really tight story, and it was called the Clovis First model. As the ice sheets receded, a corridor opened up, and groups from Asia were able to come across the Bering Land Bridge. So again, ice sheets were locking up water out of the ocean, dropping the ocean levels, and we had a large land shelf that was exposed, giving a pathway between the old world and the new world. And we know that this was open multiple times because we can see the movement of ice age animals from the old world to the new world. Elephants, camels, rhinoceroses, all kinds of animals kind of exchanged land masses when these land bridges were open, and they closed after a while. So the ice sheets recede, this corridor, what's called the ice-free corridor, opens up, and people are able to migrate through into the heartland of the North American continent and then subsequently radiate down southward. A number of years ago, a site at Monteverde kind of threw this into question. Clovis is very interesting. We don't have a lot of radiocarbon dates on this across North America, and their radiocarbon dates are especially sparse in eastern North America, but they tightly cluster at around 11,000 radiocarbon years ago, or about 12.5 to 13,000 calendar years ago. Coinciding with this kind of radiocarbon date range is the disappearance of many of the Ice Age megafauna. So Clovis first explained a couple of things very nicely. The first appearance of humans in North America, and they enter in, they come upon a landscape full of these Ice Age animals that have never been subjected to human predation anymore. They're naive, and so they're easily hunted, and we kind of wipe them out as we advance in a bloodthirsty kind of wave ever southward. And so for 75 years or so, Clovis first was the dogma of the colonization event. There was always a number of sites, what we call PreClovis, that were out there that seemed to date earlier than Clovis, but they never were very widely accepted. They usually had problems in the excavation of the site. The stratigraphy may have been, subject to mixing, so or faunal preservation was bad. So there was always a number of contenders out there, but the vast majority of them had what we call a pretty short shelf life. They came and went, they've been dismissed, but a few of them have hung in there. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania has pretty good evidence of people here 15 to 17,000 years ago. Cactus Hill on the East Coast, Spirit Cave, and we have a number of archaeological sites up in the Alaska region that are contemporaneous with Clovis. But it really was Monteverde down here in southern Chile, which is about 1,500 years older than Clovis, which has gained universal widespread acceptance. And so it kind of broke the time barrier. And people have been a lot more accepting or open to think about maybe Clovis isn't the earliest presence of humans in the New World. Part of what we can say about Clovis is that absolutely it is the first robust and easily archaeologically visible signature of humans in the New World. So a lot of archaeology is really kind of a sampling game. And always in finding the earliest of any kind of event is going to be very difficult because populations are low, and as populations increase over time, the amount of garbage that people leave behind, and that's what results in the archaeological record, builds up and it crosses eventually a threshold of visibility where we can see it and recognize it on a consistent basis. And to me, that's what Clovis represents. It's the first patterned kind of event in the North American archaeological record, and that's what we as archaeologists really look at as patterning, and we always have to be aware of that sampling bias. So the Clovis is the first thing that we can recognize. It's consistent, we can see it, we can understand it, and it's very interesting. It's continent-wide. It's one of the few times in North American prehistory where we have a cohesive, nearly coast-to-coast wide, single cultural adaptation. And that's unusual for hunters and gatherers because east to west, north to south, there's a lot of different regions and environments in North America, and particularly at the end of the last ice age, these climates were changing rapidly. So that's the other thing that kind of interested me in Clovis, is how did these people adapt to such a dynamic and shifting landscape? So these were that was one of the questions I was trying to answer or think about in my dissertation research. So now we've kind of been open more to the pre-Clovis models. We're recognizing that migration along the coasts, watercraft technology is probably in the game. But again, kind of evaluating or testing those scenarios is very difficult because these coastlines are now deeply submerged. I've been involved in a project out in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Clovis age shoreline, we were doing sonar work and mapping the seafloor. The late glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, the coastline was 90 miles or more out into the Gulf of Mexico. So you can imagine there's a lot of territory. So Clovis is at least 30 miles out. If these people are living on the coast or using boats, it's going to be very hard to see because those landscapes are now submerged, and we're only now beginning to kind of get that technology where we can access these kind of landscapes and get a look at them. But so the coastal migration routes are probably very probable. We also have now even kind of more dramatic scenarios, the North Atlantic route, the Solutrean hypothesis. Part of the problem in trying to determine the origin of Clovis is that the fluted point is the first North American invention. We've never been able to work it backwards from North America into Alaska and then further south, which means that people came here without the Clovis point, and this technology or this tradition develops here. And it's very distinctive. So anytime we see these kind of projectile points that have these large flakes driven from the bottom up towards the top, probably as a convention to aid in hafting. I'll pass a few of these around so people can take a look at them. They're very distinctive. So when we find one, it's what we call an index fossil or a kind of a horizon marker. We've never found these in Alaska or further south, so we've never been able to trace the origins of Clovis technologically. We have very few skeletal remains from this time period, so it's hard to track them genetically. But as this Clovis first kind of scenario where people from East Asia, the Asian continent, migrated in, it was a very, very nice kind of story. It's kind of starting to be open to question now with the greater acceptance of some of these other pre-Clovis sites, and realizing that the single migration hypothesis or scenario is probably way too simplistic. So pre-Clovis, that's probably, I could give it another talk on that sometime, but we'll stick with Clovis. We'll keep moving forward. So what was it like here 13,000 years ago? It was a very different place. It was a different landscape that these people were encountering. We probably had something like this up in northern Illinois, an open spruce parkland, and further south and in major river valleys we had mixed closed forests. We know this because we can look at the pollen records and from bogs and lakes and see the kind of succession of plants. Now over time, the modern kind of what we think of the oak hickory forest just kind of moved progressively north, and this habitat moved north along as those ice sheets continued to recede north. But we had a completely different suite of large mammal on the landscape: mammoth, mastodon, caribou, muskox, stag moose, and a suite of predators. We had saber-toothed cats here, giant short-faced bear. This was the largest land mammal predator ever in North America. So some of these things would have been pretty neat, some of which I'm pretty sure we're all pretty glad are no longer with us. And also we have, at this point, the earliest robust evidence for humans, so the Clovis culture. And again, they're very distinctive, these lancelet spear points with these flakes driven up from the base. And this was first defined out in New Mexico at the Blackwater Draw site, where these points were found in association with mammoths. And it's a pattern that we've repeated at a good another dozen or more sites, mainly out in the west. And there's a little bit of a historical bias in this kind of a situation. What's easier to find? The bones of an elephant eroding out of a cut bank, or a small projectile point? Most of these discoveries start out as a paleontological discovery. Somebody notices the bones eroding out, and then they start excavating. A museum wants them for their exhibitor display, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a projectile point in there. So another kind of bias in our viewpoint of Clovis is that the nature of the discovery of the archaeological record. If they're hunting rabbits, we probably won't see that because the bones of small mammals and animals preserve at a much lower rate in the archaeological record than do the larger bones. So we have a preservation bias here too. In Illinois, we have no sites of Clovis with radiocarbon dates. We have none that have preserved floral or faunal remains that let us know what they were eating, how they were surviving, what their kind of, economic orientation was. So I said I've got to kind of move outward to several scales of view, from the artifact to the site level to the regional level, so I can try and, in the absence of that kind of nice information, build a story. These finds of Clovis points and mammoth bones have become ingrained in the public consciousness. And if you get on the website and you Google Clovis Hunters, you'll come up with lots of images like these. I enjoy these. They're very romanticized. Almost inevitably, you've got some guy dead laying on the ground or being thrown, half-clad savages throwing spears and or rocks at elephants. Probably not very realistic. I like to call these depictions the first Darwin Award winners. But the other thing I look at here is realizing that, okay, there's a bias in here. So we've got this popular misconception of Clovis entering in. They're the great elephant hunters. The overkill hypothesis that they wipe out all the megafauna and they just kind of sweep from all the way down into South America. A very kind of simplistic and romantic notion. But I look at these pictures here and I think, what's missing besides this guy's pants? Where are the women? Where are the children? This is not a very nuanced kind of viewpoint of the lifestyle of these folks. So this is kind of what I was coming up against when I started my research and started recording points in 1965. The first thing you do is you hit the literature, and we had Howard Winter's studies from Southern Illinois in 1962. He had recorded a grand total of 14 fluted points. I said, well, that'll be a short dissertation. So I kept looking around. Jim Stoltman, Karen Workman in 1969 had done a fluted point study up in Wisconsin. They had 65 points. And I said, I went to the Illinois State Museum. They had a grand total, I think, of 3. I said, this is going to be a very short dissertation. So I started a fluted point survey for Illinois and Wisconsin. I started to systematically go to the museums, to the historical societies, to the avocational groups, to the collectors in particular, because that's where a lot of this data resides. I began that in 1996. I'm still doing it. Again, it's become a never-ending project. So public outreach education, we've now bumped that total up to well over 1,000 fluted points from Illinois and Wisconsin. As my wife says, the Stone Age meets the social media age. I've got a website, and we're on Facebook and all of that stuff. So, but that's been great. It's been a great outreach effort. And it's also taught me something else, that this kind of record resides in 1 or 2 artifacts scattered over large regions, which tells us something about the nature of populations and the nature of the people at this time. There's not a lot of people on the landscape, and they're spread very thinly. And most of the data is not in the hands of archaeologists, because we're lucky if we get to go and visit a site once or twice, and we have to then make a call on the cultural affiliation, the age of the site. These things are found by folks who go and they hunt a site for 5 or 10 years, or they're at it 20, 30 times, and they're finding archaic points, and then all of a sudden, after their 50th visit or 100th visit, one of these things pops out. So the archaeological record, as it's been largely driven by compliance work, is very biased against this, because again, we get to go see a site once or twice. And there's been no long-term academic research kind of pointed towards this time period in Illinois either. So I was really kind of looking at a blank spot on the map in many ways. So part of my dissertation research was to fill that in and see what it told us. So we've gone now from Illinois. We can look at things as single data points on the landscape representing either single finds of isolated artifacts. We can look at it. Traditionally, these things are counted by county. and tallied up and given kind of distributional. We can, with the advent of computer-aided systems, GIS is a wonderful tool. We can enter these in and analyze these things at very kind of, different levels. But we can, again, we look for patterning. So here, west of the Rock River, we see very few fluted points. We see a really robust break up to the north. So I started looking at just the single point and then looking at several sites. And I tried to, again, make this kind of a regional framework. And so Hawks Nest was the site that I started out. And we have Abish, Anderson in DeKalb County, Ambler in LaSalle County, Withington and Grant. And we've got Cuba and Scari up in the Four Lakes area, Abisher, very interesting one up in Carty, Calumet and Door County or Sturgeon Bay. And then I also started to look at some raw material sites. So things like the Moline chert source and Hickston. These are two that were particularly interesting to me because they're very visually distinctive. It's easy to identify the raw material when you see it. And both of them are fairly discrete point sources. That material is not available over a very wide area, so they outcrop in a small area. So things like Burlington, which have very large ranges where you can get it, when you find a Burlington fluted point, it's not as easy to draw a line backwards. So Abisher and Carty have lots of Moline fluted points, so we can go back to Moline and draw lines back and reconstruct the movement of people across the landscape. So that was part of one of the aims of my dissertation. So what I did is I plotted out the distribution of various fluted points by raw material to see if I could see any kind of trends or patterning in that. So Hickston and Moline, Starved Rock or Oneota, Platteville, Galena, Attica from Indiana, Cobden from Southern Illinois. I don't throw things like Burlington in there, even though Burlington probably is 50% or more of my sample, because again, it outcrops from wide kind of area here. So just looking at point source areas, and compiling that information gets you a colorful blob of spaghetti here. But we can pull this apart, right, and look for patterning, and that's what I did. So the first thing that we can see is that there's a very strong north-south trend to the movement of raw material. This is probably linked to seasonal movements. Hunters and gatherers pattern their movement across the landscape in accordance with the availability of seasonal resources. So they move in spring, summer, winter, fall. And we can also look at the distance of some of these movements. One-way or seasonal range movements, 300 to 400 kilometers, which means that we have annual movements probably on the order of 700 plus kilometers. This is off the high end of the scale for what we know about ethnographic hunters and gatherers who are largely pedestrian. So going back to the ethnographic record to compare these folks to is also very difficult because we don't have a good analog for people that are this mobile and operating in these kind of very unusual environmental and dynamic situations. When you pull it apart, one thing that jumped out at me is that there's two major lithic movement systems. Okay, we've got a system where we've got, in particular, Cobden and Attica with a heavy overlap, and Moline and Hickston with a heavy overlap. So they co-occur. So I interpreted this as movements of groups between back and forth these two sources on a seasonal basis. One thing that started to interest me is these outliers here, things that are moving outside of their normal distribution ranges. What we're probably looking at here is multi-year patterning. Okay, and again, this is kind of a palimpsest. We don't have age dates, but when we look at another interesting thing about Clovis is when we do look at the available radiocarbon record, it's a very short interval. Some have argued it's maybe as short as a few hundred years that these folks lasted, which means they came into the country, into the continent, and within a couple of hundred years, they populated all of North America and made it all the way down to the southern tip of South America almost. So it's also off the scale from any kind of speed of colonization movement that we know of. Now, when we look at some of the site level, moving from regional back to site and to the artifact, kind of shifting our scale of view back and forth here, we look at some interesting things. Ambler is a really interesting site in LaSalle County. It's all Hixton from up here in Jackson County, Wisconsin. That's a 350 kilometer movement. It's largely dominated by hunting and butchering related tools, so a lot of scrapers. And a lot of it has the rough outer cortex left on the material. Now, one thing that we can ask is, how did these people get their raw material? Did they get it directly by themselves, or did they obtain it through trade or down the line? It's likely that these folks directly procured this material, what we call embedded procurement, during their seasonal movements across the landscape. Trade requires a few things, one of which is neighbors. There probably weren't enough people on the landscape for trade to be a very reliable way to obtain the raw materials that you needed. It would have been really risky, okay? So what if you don't run into other people, okay, to trade for what you needed? You'd be in trouble. So direct procurement is probably what we're seeing here. And this rough outer surface probably would have been removed before, if it was going to be traded, so that you dress up the raw material. Okay, people don't want to trade for the cruddy stuff. Okay, so we would expect that to drop off. The fact that it's still on here also, to me, says that it's direct procurement and also a fairly rapid movement southward. Hixton has to be pit mined, which means you have to dig it out of the ground. And you probably don't want to be up there during the winter time 13,000 years ago. Some folks may not want to be up there in the winter time now. So to me, that says it's a warm weather procurement. Okay, so they're probably getting it in the summer or fall, and they're gearing up, they're stocking up for their southward movement for their wintering over areas. And so it's a movement south. On the other hand, we see at the Abisher site in Calumet County the opposite movement of Moline moving north. And this follows actually the Rock River watershed. If you keep going up the Rock River, eventually you'll get into the headwaters of the Horican Marsh system, and it dumps you out right up in here. It's almost all Moline. There's not a lot of chert resources up in this area, so we have groups that are gearing up. Okay, and here we have lots of weaponry, okay, and processing materials. There's a little bit of other Illinois materials mixed in, Burlington. But what we see here is people gearing up with the material, moving here, and then doing a lot of their production here. We have failures of manufacturing for replacement weaponry. We've got a lot of broken, expended weaponry, hide processing tools. So to me, this is a signature of they're moving in, they're hunting in the area. Okay, and they're processing a lot of game. If we looked at what this environment was probably like at the end of the last ice age, it's probably a really good analogy to modern caribou calving habitat that we see further north. So here, my theory is that these folks are moving northward with the spring migratory mood of caribou herd movements to the north, and up into their calving grounds, and these folks are attaching themselves to these herds moving through and hunting on them. Really interesting is that Cardi is another site up here that's also heavily dominated by Moline chert. But one interesting thing is that by the time they get to Cardi, they've started to incorporate a few of the local chert resources into their toolkit, which are completely absent at Abisher. Which to me says the folks who were at Abisher didn't know that there was chert available up there because they hadn't been there that far yet. So we can sequence Abisher is probably a little bit older than Cardi. But what's happening over time is that as those ice sheets keep moving north and that environment keeps changing, that environment for caribou keeps shifting farther north, these people have to increase their range over time. So it's an increase in mobility. So how to handle environmental change? They had to monitor, okay, or occupy a much larger territory. But they were still tied to these northern Illinois chert sources, again, which is part of that, the other end of it, of that seasonal rounding. So we see an increase in mobility and monitoring costs over time. So again, my hypothesis was that it's caribou. Again, we don't have any sites that have caribou bones at them. So how do we proceed to a supportable story in the absence of some evidence? The Mueller and Keck sites down in Jersey County, in the American Bottom, again, are really interesting because they're loaded with chert from Indiana. So these people are gearing up, they're stocking up, they're moving into an area, but there's tons of chert available there. So why would they do that? Okay, why not just, when you get there, get all the chert you need and gear up that way? To me, that was kind of it's a somewhat interesting and different kind of problem to solve. So to me, there's an anticipation there that when they get there, they want to be ready to go. So it's kind of almost like Abisher. When they get there, they want to hit the ground running because it's a resource-rich area probably. But the other reason is that you've got to transverse this kind of interior area of Illinois where there's almost no chert availability, okay? So you're going to be moving through a chert-poor area. So that also tells me something about these people are fairly well settled into the landscape by this point. They know where the resources are. They know, or they can fairly accurately predict the locations of resources, and they've kind of adjusted their technological organization accordingly. So if we put this kind of together, we've got these materialithic or raw material conveyance zones is what I called them. The one to the north kind of is interesting, is it operates in this counterclockwise rotation, moving from the Moline source up to sites like Abisher and Carty, and then sweeping through Hickston and Cochrane is another one here, and then coming back into what's the upper Illinois River Valley, seems to be. And where we have some local cherts there that have a much lower dispersal. Attica and Cobden overlap, and you've got this clockwise rotation, and Cobden is really interesting because it really just follows the Illinois River Valley northward. So one unexpected kind of outcome of my dissertation research was the identification of these overlap zones. Okay, not just in the sense of the Hickston and Moline, but the overlap of these two different systems, okay? So these overlaps individually were telling me probably something about the structure of people's movements over the landscape over time. But the overlaps between the overlaps kind of gave me another insight. What's the other critical resource that people are going to need when you're very thinly dispersed across the landscape and you're very mobile? That's other people, right? Spouses, right. Well, we'll say it nicely. How do you maintain a viable mating network, right? We can assume that the incest taboos are in place, okay? When we look at the toolkits from these sites, they're probably small family groups. You probably have maybe 5 to 25 people, moving in a group. They're probably related by blood and by marriage. At certain points, you've got young males and females that you got to do something with, right? So you got to get them partners. So these overlaps here were kind of interesting because I said this is a portion of the landscape that we can identify as having a high potential for social interaction, okay, and solves another critical need of these folks, okay. These conveyance zones are moving between what I called sweet spots. They circulate around resource-poor areas. They're targeting sweet spots on the landscapes like caribou calving habitat, lithic source areas down in the American Bottom. This was probably a very rich area. Another thing that's happening as the environment's changing, the resource, or the habitat that these mammoths, mastodon, other megafauna are adapted to, are getting fewer and farther in between. Okay, so we have what Gary Haynes has called the refugia of ice age kind of conditions, or spots in the landscape that would have allowed these animals to they would have been congregating into and surviving a little bit longer. The American bottom was probably one of these areas, upper Illinois River Valley, and with caribou up to the north, Abishur-Carty sites. So we've got two distinct territories with an overlap here, right? These overlapping zones kind of define habitual use areas, or areas that these folks are operating consistently on over multi-year kind of seasonal and annual ranges. So it's kind of a way of identifying a redundant kind of territories. These overlapping but separate bounds here, we're defining band boundaries, and these north-south trends are really giving us routine kind of north-south, probably seasonal movements. Something else that obviously here we've got a geographic boundary by the Great Lakes to the east. Mississippi River, right? It was really apparent this stuff does not go very far across the river. Neither Moline nor Hickston, which are not very far. So we've got a boundary here. Here we've got an ecological boundary. Okay, and this area is just not fit yet for colonization. So we have an environmental barrier here, geographic barrier here, but this really got me interested. Okay, probably what we're looking at here is a social boundary. The Mississippi is not that big of a physical barrier to cross. So why isn't that material crossing, but only occasionally? So possibly here too. We looked at Ken Tankersley work in patterning out some of the movement of Indiana and Ohio and Kentucky cherts. That's really interesting. Look at the break right here. We're probably looking at another macro band or a social boundary here. Now we've got a third kind of a system in operation here that's probably defining social groups. This is Upper Mercer and Wyandotte and Hopkinsville cherts. So here I think I'm seeing social natures to these boundaries, and we're probably seeing frontiers of macro band ranges where we're going to again have some interaction with neighboring groups, as is in the overlap over here. These outliers then became really interesting. So these southern movements of northern materials, okay, into and out of their overlap ranges kind of was an unexpected surprise. So what's this, okay? And if we look at these things and the state of the items moving out, which is really kind of an interesting phenomenon. So we get things moving out of the southern range into the northern range, and we get materials in the northern range moving into that southern zone. We have a Cobden end scraper at the Withington site up in Grant County, Wisconsin. It's 540 kilometers from its source in southern Illinois. It's 330 miles. We know the glaciers didn't drag it there, right? Because it's retrograde or reverse to the movement of the ice. So the only way that it got there is that somebody carried it there. If we look at the ethnographic record, end scrapers are almost always associated with hide working, which is usually a female task and division of labor. I think what we're seeing here, we're able to define in this instant is an exogamous movement of an individual. So again, the incest taboos in place. She's moving from this group, this social group, into this social group. She's taking some of her materials with her. The Hickston items, when they tend to move, tend to be spear points, male items. And we've got them. So Union County, this one's Indiana, this one's Ohio. So some very long distance movements. These are what we call kind of status rich, symbol rich kind of items. So things that may have been exchanged between males as a way of creating a relationship. which is another kind of risk management. So again, we look at these things. Typically, we see a pretty typical distance decay curve. So as you get farther away from the source area, you use things up, you resharpen your projectile points, they get smaller and smaller. But again, we see this jump all of a sudden in the average length of projectile points, which I think are probably trade items being exchanged between males from different social groups as a way of sharing information, okay, managing risk. We have a lot of ethnographic records where males exchange weaponry, and it's a way of kind of banking food. So if you're having a rough time with hunter-gatherers, you want to have good relationships with your neighbors, so maybe you can temporarily move in with them and they can help you out. Or you can, have a mating, an exchange, a social exchange network going here too. So what we see is that quite often these very large projectile points are moving the farthest. They haven't been used, okay, which means they're being held in reserve until they move far out into these frontier areas, at which points then they change hands and to the next social system. So we can see that kind of typical 400-kilometer movement, but then these outliers here that pop way out and tend to be projectile points and show a little sign of use. So what we see is this long-distance movement or exchange of very large, oversized, what we call style-rich artifacts, haven't been used, and they're often made on these very distinctive materials. They have a visual appeal to them, okay? And I think these are circulating within a social network that's meant to maintain and ensure that you have contact with people. So again, one of the critical other things that people are going to be faced with if we think about the Abishur and the Cardi sites, they're continually moving farther and farther over a yearly range. They're getting more dispersed across the landscape. So your chances of running into people are getting even lower, that you have to develop these kind of systems in order to maintain, ensure contact. So again, one way of doing that is exchanging or creating bonds outside, marriage patterns, okay, or bloodlines to create relationships. So we have now a mechanism in place to ensure contact in a very low population density landscape. John Walthall and Brad Koldehoff have examined this in kind of the Dalton era, where we look at what they call the alliance formation, Dalton and the cult of the long blade. Typical Dalton points are something like this. But these large, oversized things are the ones that get exchanged, okay? So these things, and they're often made, bigger than normal, right? So beyond functional use. And they explain the exchange of these things as a result of packing. By Dalton, we start to see people settling into the landscape. So the first time we've got populations probably building a little bit, they're starting to pack in and they're occupying defined territories. So here we kind of have an opposite problem. Now we have neighbors. What happens when you have neighbors? Now you have to deal with them, right, all the time. So instead of having an exchange network where you're exchanging gigantic fluted points, and so this is from the East Wenatchee site here, so these ceremonially function, kind of made for ceremonial functions. We have an increase in social interaction by Dalton period. That results in tensions, and so we're exchanging things as a way of creating alliances to buffer these tensions, because now we have neighbors. So this exchanges to counter the potential interband resource or discord. Whereas the Clovis period, we have the exchange of these items to ensure that we're contacting and interacting with other people, because we are so dispersed. And we see some of this material, Knife River Flint. This is from Marionette County, Wisconsin. That's 800 miles away from where that material was quarried in western North Dakota. So here we've got exchange to counter because we've got neighbors. Here we've got exchange because we don't have neighbors. So here we get all of a sudden a hint into the social systems of these people, right? Not just So life is more than just eating every day. Okay, we've got to have, but those other actions don't preserve very readily within the archaeological record. They're hard to see. You've got to take these very large scale views before you get kind of very subtle hints at it. So within Clovis, we got these regional patterns of raw material, commonly at a regional scale, and entire toolkits made of raw materials, which is the movement of entire groups. We've got these rare non-local finds like that Cobden end scraper or these Hickston Clovis points, which could be the movement of individuals, marriages. And then we get these very rare finds of these oversized, these style-rich, specifically made things that are being exchanged to foster contact and relationship between groups or to kind of smooth over the relationships between groups. Immediately following Clovis, okay, we get a series of archaeological complexes which are very influenced by the plains. We've got Folsom coming in. We've got the Cody Complex, Scotts Bluff, and Alberta and Hell Gap. And within this record, there's a really interesting pattern that's started to come out. And again, where we have good evidence for ritual activity. And I'll talk about a couple of sites here very quickly. Gordo and Renier, Pope, Elmwood Island, Caradoc and Crowfield up in Wisconsin, and a new one that I've been working on in the last few years in northwest Illinois that we call the DeWolf site. We'll start with the Renier site because this is the first and most well-known. Brown County, Wisconsin, dug by Ron and Carol Mason. 1959, they're up on the overlooking the Bay of Green Bay, and they just said, that looks like a really good spot. I bet there's a site there. They picked it because it was the highest spot. And they put a 5x5 square down. There was no surface expression, and they just came down upon an incredible site. What they found was these Scotts Bluff or Cody Complex projectile points, which are probably dated to about 9,000 years ago, made out of Hickston, and that had all been burned. Okay, so intentionally destroyed. And with them was this odd little fella here, which is probably a Thebes variant point, which is 8,500, 9,000 years old, made on a chert. And there's actually two of them. When I went through and reanalyzed that, there's two of them in there. Along with that was the cremated remains of a subadult. This is probably a young child, and who was buried with these grave offerings. This is also kind of counter to what we think about status in hunter-gatherer groups, where it's accrued over time. So children and young don't have a lot of high status because they haven't lived long enough to do all the deeds to earn that status. So kind of unusual that we would find such a young child buried with such a large assemblage. What we would think of wealth, really, right, are all these grave goods that had been put in with the cremation. So the Pope site in Wapaka County, again, Cody Complex, same type of point, same style, made out of Hickston, all burned, and big bifaces. And I should say that in Renier, there's also a number. My slide is not showing up for some reason, but these very large bifaces that were put in there, broken, and then burned. So the Pope site, we have the same thing. Gordo, up in the Upper Peninsula. This is a fabulous site. Common denominator, the use of Hickston, same style of points here. We've got those Cody Complex, but now we've also got here another one of these little notched guys made on chert, just like at Renier. But we've got classic kind of hardened, eared Scotts Bluff, these kind of transitional Thebes or dovetails. So we've got a couple of different styles of points in here. So if points are people and people are making points to different styles as a way to mark their group identity or social identity, do we have here possibly the interaction of several different groups on the landscape? We don't have human remains at this site or the Pope site, so whether or not this was a cremation, we just can't say. But all of these things, and it's hard to kind of gauge these things looking at them in a photograph. These are oversized, okay? They're not intended for everyday use. They've been moved several hundred miles from source. They're made specifically for this event to be destroyed. You get them in your hand and you really see that these things are just whoppers, okay? And so again, this one was broken before it was burned, and here we can see burning fractures on it. So again, a lot of investment and time to procure this material, transport it a great distance, and Hixton seems to be the key. They're always using the same material and making these points larger than normal, okay, and then burning them. So to me, this is kind of a very ritual kind of a sign. Elmwood Island, Dodge County, 2 very large Scottsbluff points were recovered from a pit feature filled with red ochre. Again, maybe some kind of a ritual offering. And again, we're looking at 2 and 3 inches here. This is, well, again, very large. Deadman Slough in Price County, one of our other fellow employees at ECIAS, Steve Keene, worked there. They dug this site. Again, Hixton, Scottsbluff, Cody Complex, big burned up bifaces. Here's that chert, notched point. Again, so these patterns kind of constantly playing out that had all been burned up, okay? They argue there that the bifaces are the result of ceremonial activity, not related to burial activity. We don't know because the preservation is just not there. If there was human bone, it's gone. But they said the intentional breakage of these large bifaces and points suggests a ritual offering during some kind of a sacred ceremony. So again, patterning. Right now, we've seen a handful of sites with this same behavior. Okay, it's, and then we can interpret them together in a tighter package. They define what they call the Renier ceremonial complex, with the Renier, Pope, Deadman Slough, Gordo. I would add in Elmwood Island, but again, thermal destruction of Scottsbluff points, very large Hixton bifaces, possibly representing mortuary activities or at a minimum some kind of a ritual activity. And they suggest dates of 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. So based on Scottsbluff, I would probably lean towards the 8,000 or more from what we know about sites of that complex further west, which are better dated. Cummings up north is an interesting, that's a cremation burial up there. Crowfield is a really interesting site. That's a fluted point complex site that is probably also mortuary related, where they had an entire toolkit and all of these very beautifully crafted points burned. So possibly another cremation offering. So we can see there's something going on in the Great Lakes. So to sum up here, we've got in the early Paleo-Indian, we've got social systems where we see ceremonial exchange to foster intergroup contact and alliances. By late Paleo-Indian Dalton, we've got the manufacture and exchange to buffer tensions, and it culminates, or it's by this point, it's really patterned and it's archaeologically visible, and with this Renier ceremonial complex, where we've got Scottsbluff Cody 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, shared use of Hixton. They're making these oversized bifaces with the intent to destroy them. Mix of point styles, possibly that represents, again, social interactions with different groups. The wolf site, I think, is the earliest of the bunch, and it's also the largest by far in terms of the size of the assemblage to date. And it extends that behavior further west and to the south. So again, these Cody Scottsbluff points are typically thought of as a plains group. So possibly we have a colonization event, a movement of people into a new landscape. And when you do that, right, you've got to enculture that landscape with new behaviors. And I think that's probably what we're seeing here. So I hope I haven't made a confusing subject all the more confusing. And hopefully we've moved away from, the bloodthirsty mammoth hunters and do a little more nuanced viewpoint of these people as operating within social groups and systems. Men and women and children, where are they in the archaeological record? We absolutely know that they're there. And I kind of term this process of, it's putting the pants back on these people. So I hope I've done that, and that's all. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions for you.